Hello, and welcome back to A Sci-Fi Author Reads, your temporary escape from your COVID-19 lockdown. My t-shirt today is brought to you courtesy of my wonderful daughter and son-in-law and their two children, just to remind you to stay indoors, stay safe, stay well. So today's chapter is chapter 1, From Awakening, and just to remind you that there will be bad language, there may be sexual references, and probably political incorrectness as well. So if you want to get angry, too late, I've already warned you. So let's get straight into it. Chapter 1, and the date is Monday, the 4th of September, 1972. Class, settle down, settle down. Mr. Phillips, the headmaster, shouted as he banged the teacher's desk with the end of a wooden ruler to get everyone's attention. The general hubbub of teenagers discussing vitally important subjects with friends they hadn't seen since yesterday, or even as far back as Friday, slowly died away. The head teacher waited impatiently, drumming his chubby fingers on the wooden desk. He didn't carry the natural air of authority required to command the respect of a horde of boisterous students. Instead, he relied on the rule of law to enforce his power. As a result, most students disliked him, and some deliberately tested the boundaries to see how far he could be pushed. His face resembled that of a pale frog, with a large translucent wart on the edge of his nose, which earned him the unkind nickname of Bubble. He was tolerated by students rather than respected, knowing that the alternative could be the deputy head, who was considered to be a complete tyrant and barely human, or possibly worse, someone new. However, this morning it was not the head that brought the class to order, but rather the girl by his side and slightly behind him, who, while trying to remain inconspicuous, stood out like a sore thumb. She stood a shade over 5 feet tall in her low-heeled, masculine-looking shoes. Straight, collar-length brown hair framed her face in a simple page-boy cut, the fringe of which cut across her forehead just above her thick, dark eyebrows. Her large, dark brown eyes blinked nervously at the assembled students in front of her, like a petrified gazelle who had inadvertently stumbled into a pride of 29 hungry lions. She was slightly built and wearing a non-regulation navy blue V-neck jumper with another school's crest on the left breast. A white blouse buttoned to the throat, no tie, and black trousers. This was in stark contrast to everyone else's green jumpers and blazers, with gold piping on the cuffs and lapels, and green and gold striped ties. The girls all wore neatly pleated skirts and regulation dark green woolen tights. The leather satchel was in pristine condition, again in contrast to the array of satchels, duffel bags, rucksacks, all scattered around, all of which were careworn, covered in graffiti and bulged to capacity with books and writing materials and teenage detritus. A couple of the boys sniggered openly. Class, this is Petra Connell. Mr. Phillips ushered the girl out of his shadow and into the full glare of the spotlight, resting a plump hand on her shoulder. Petra has just moved into the area and will be joining us this year. Make her feel welcome. It was an order rather than a request, but it would be accepted or ignored as the assembled students saw fit. The head indicated an empty desk near the back of the class, and the girl moved towards it. She stepped slowly and carefully, as if she were treading on eggshells, but stumbled as she stood to cut her toe against a duffel bag that had mysteriously fallen into her path. More snickers, mostly from the boys. A small gasp of embarrassment escaped from her lips before she clamped them tightly together in a tight line. Her eyes narrowed, and she stared defiantly ahead. I'll expect you to be properly attired next Monday, the head called after the girl, somehow not noticing her difficulty. Mrs. Doyle may allow a more relaxed uniform code at Sir Harold Rymer, but here at Lloyd Westgate we expect our girls to dress like girls and conform to this school's standard. He flipped a dismissive finger at Petra's jumper and trousers before turning to leave without waiting for her to reply. The truth was that Petra's first choice of school was because of the uniform code. She liked dark colours, she liked trousers, she hated the idea of wearing a skirt. And woolen tights? Any tights. The invention of some evil sadist history conveniently forgotten. Why should the boys be allowed to wear trousers and not the girls? Conversely, why not force the boys to wear the infernal things as well? The thought amused her. It was also true that Sir Harold Rymer's exam results were markedly better than Lloyd Westgate High's, a testament to the fact that a rigidly enforced uniform code does not necessarily guarantee academic achievement. She would have to speak to her guardians to see if she could broker a deal on medical grounds or something. The truth was that Sir Harold Rymer had changed their mind about accepting her on medical grounds, even with her staggeringly high entrance exam results. She was too much of a risk, apparently. It also helped that Lloyd Westgate was underachieving, undersubscribed, and seemed to be willing to overlook her health issues and particular requirements. So at least she had something to start with. So, Petra, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself? Mr. Wilson prompted as soon as Mr. Phillips had left the room. Not really, Petra answered, shaking her head. This was a really bad idea, she thought. It was your idea, she reminded herself. It was still a really bad idea, she retorted to herself petulantly. That wasn't a suggestion, Petra, Mr. Wilson admonished her while trying to keep his tone light so as not to frighten her. She seemed terrified, more than he would expect of the average 15-year-old, even given the circumstances. I'm sure the whole class is dying to meet you, he added. Now, stand up and introduce yourself, Mr. Wilson said, making the all-rise movement with his hands. Petra stood up. The scrape of her chair on the tiled floor sounded like a screaming banshee in her ears as she pushed it back in silence. My name is Petra Connell, she began, looking at her desk and suddenly finding the etchings and graffiti on it strangely engrossing. Who were PF and LB? Were they still in love 2 years later? Did Jezza really have a big... Speak up, someone shouted, interrupting her thoughts. We can't hear you, another voice shouted insolently. Petra looked up and stared into the middle distance, gathering her thoughts as she started again. My name is Petra Connell. I'm 15 years old. I moved here in July. I was supposed to go to Sir Harold Rymer High because it's closer to my new home, but they were full, so now I'm here, she ad-libbed, twisting the facts and half-truths to fit the situation. She sat down and held her head defiantly, but her body looked as if it would take flight from the room at the slightest provocation. Mr. Wilson's expression said he was unimpressed by her all-too-short monologue, but he didn't press. Okay, class, registration, he announced, taking the focus off the new arrival. He sat and took a large book from his desk, opened it, and began to call names in alphabetical order and mark the register. This was the first day of the new school year, and the first time he had met all his students. The class, on the other hand, had been together for 2 years already. Most of them had moved to this school together, and most had known each other since primary school. They had a reputation for sometimes being unruly, always vocal, and usually at the centre of any mass mischief, which was the main reason Alan Wilson had been made their form tutor. Mr. Wilson closed his book, locked it in a drawer, and stood up. I'll be back in 5 minutes. I have to speak to Miss Armitage, he explained, and left the room. Sniggers and whispers sprang up as soon as the door closed. Everyone knew that Mr. Wilson and Miss Armitage were seeing each other. It was no big secret. They did try to keep their personal life separate from their school lives, though. The idea of two teachers getting it on repulsed many students, although a small minority, notably the girls, found it sweet that two older people could still find love at their age. They must be at least 30. Alan was actually 28 and a handsome man with wavy blonde hair. Sandra Armitage was 3 years older, with green eyes and long auburn hair that she usually braided into pigtails that stuck out from the side of her head like grafted-on appendages. Miss Armitage, or Hippie, as the students referred to her out of earshot, was also the head of the art department. No one could remember if her nickname was because of her pear-shaped figure her penchant for denim skirts and homemade tie-dye t-shirts. Either way, they were an odd couple, but they were both single. Well, Sandra was divorced, so they didn't care who knew, unlike two other teachers they could mention. Everyone stood up and crowded around Petra. Then the question started. You talk funny. Are you foreign? She ignored that one for the moment. Where are you from? A fair question, Petra thought, thrown at her from the midst of a sea of faces. I've been ill. I've been in hospital, Petra admitted. Wrong answer. She realised her mistake the instant she said it. She should have said Leeds, Bulgaria, or the third parallel dimension, even in jail for GBH, anything but hospital. The little monsters would pick up on that and ask questions she was not prepared to answer yet, if ever. Her misgivings were immediately validated. What's wrong with you? Is it catching? Should we be inoculated? What's wrong with your hair? It doesn't look right. Are you wearing a wig? Have you had a lobotomy? Have you got cancer? Are you a psycho? So many people invading her personal space. Claustrophobia gripped her throat and paralysed her brain. Why couldn't they just line up in an orderly fashion and ask sensible questions one at a time? That's what she had prepared for. She should have stayed where she was for another year at least, preferably longer. She was not ready for this. Unconsciously, she put her hands to her head to straighten her hair, even though it hadn't moved. I hate this thing. And how the hell did they know? All her research had been a complete waste of time. She had drawn up numerous scenarios based on her research, complete with stock answers to questions she expected, but none of it matched reality. She found herself completely unprepared for the onslaught. Even the cover story she had carefully cooked up with her guardians sounded amateurish and stupid in the full glare of reality. In a panic, she pushed back her chair and fought her way through the throng, who had picked up on her last assertion. She's a psycho. The affirmation was a stage whisper somewhere in the middle of the crowd and was repeated around her as she pushed her way clear. She's going to barf. She's going to cry. Cancer. The big C. My uncle had cancer. Liar. Leukemia. VD. You don't even know what that means. Fuck you. The assertions, accusations, and side comments came thick and fast, propelling her along like a physical force. Just what she needed. More attention. Some of the girls looked at her with an expression of pity. The boys looked at her as if she carried the Black Death. Great. She was the special case. She'd read about that in her research. There was always one poor kid in every class who was singled out to be the brunt of all prejudices in the group. She had read how this person could be bullied mercilessly, lead pitiful lives with no friends, and could even end up committing suicide. School children revelled in their individuality, as long as they didn't stand out from the rest of the peer group. This whole project was poorly constructed and executed. They should have thought her story through more and anticipated the questions better. But then it had been a long time since her guardians had been teenagers, if they ever were, and she had never been one before today. It was too late now. What had started out as a great adventure at breakfast was quickly turning into a nightmare. Maybe she could just leave. Maybe she could try another school. She stood up, but a large boy blocked her path. Get out of my way, she growled. Or what? He leered back at her. She feinted right, and he shifted his weight to stop her, but she dodged left and swept his foot just enough to unbalance him. He crashed noisily to the floor, taking a couple of chairs with him. Petra jumped over him and ran for the door and barreled straight into the returning Mr. Wilson. Yes, Petra? Mr. Wilson looked down at her in surprise. I think I want to go home now, she stammered. Please? Are you feeling ill? He asked, pulling his eyebrows together in concern. He knew the new girl had health problems, but he was expecting her to at least last until past registration. No, but, Petra began. Idiot! The answer was yes. Mr. Wilson's concern evaporated. Then sit down, Petra, and don't be silly. More titters rippled round the room, but quickly died away as Mr. Wilson scowled at the offenders. That's enough. Seats, now. Mr. Wilson ordered, turning his attention to the rest of the class. The assembled students complied quickly, but with a great deal of noise from scraping of chairs and desks. Psycho bitch! The boy she had tackled hissed at her as she passed. Stephen, my desk now! The pudgy boy moved petulantly forward, grimacing over his shoulder at her. He winked to his companions theatrically, hinting of games to come. I will not have that sort of behaviour in my class. Is that clear? Mr. Wilson said forcefully, wagging a finger at Stephen. Yes, sir, the boy replied tritely. You will go to Petra and apologise. Do you understand? Petra's eyes grew large with panic. She shook her head vigorously and mouthed, No, please, to Mr. Wilson, who either did not see or ignored the gesture. The boy moved belligerently down the aisle until he stood at the side of the small girl's desk. Petra stared forward with a stony expression, refusing to catch the malicious glint in his eye. I'm sorry, he said with mock sincerity. Good enough. Now sit, Mr. Wilson acknowledged. The boy moved to his own desk, 3 rows forward and 1 to the right, and sat throwing threatening looks over at the newcomer. As for the rest of you, I am disgusted at your attitude. At the end of this year, some, if not all of you, will be leaving to find jobs in the real world. Childish and, quite frankly, abusive behaviour like this will land you in real trouble. Now, Petra has been recovering from a long illness and needs your help and support. The euphemism was not lost on the assembled class. See, told you, cancer, leukemia. Same thing, piss off. Don't be so cruel. Shut it, McAllister. Whatever. Petra, what's your first class? Mr. Wilson asked. Physics, sir, she replied, after studying a sheet of paper with a neatly drawn matrix on it. Not that she needed to. She had memorized her whole week's schedule, including rooms and teachers' names. What room? GL1, sir, she replied after a second glance. Jennifer, show Petra to her first lesson, please. But, sir, the blonde girl at the back of the class protested. It's on your way. I have French first period, she protested. It's at the other end of the school to the language labs, and it's on the wrong floor. Then the walk will do you good. I'm sure Madame Arnard will understand. Whatever, the girl replied resignedly with a sullen shrug. Right on cue, the bell for first period rang. The class rose noisily and ambled towards the door like a herd of wildebeests. Come on, you, Jennifer cast over her shoulder as she stalked towards the door. Petra attempted to rise, but a passing elbow caught her shoulder and she lost her balance, sending her crashing noisily to her chair. Stephen grinned over his shoulder. Petra was sure he sat in front of her and in a different row. He must have gone to the back of the room just to walk past her. She waited patiently until the room had cleared, rose again and met Jennifer, who was waiting impatiently in the corridor. This way, the girl said without preamble and marched off. I know where to go, Petra muttered, but whatever. Jennifer cut her off from asking for the company. Then you don't need me. The girl turned on her heel and stalked off down the corridor to the stairway at the other end of the long building without a second glance. Petra turned and watched the retreating figure for a moment, raised an eyebrow, turned away, then back again to watch the girl disappear down the stairs. Petra paused, shook her head as if dispelling an unpalatable thought, and moved off to her destination again. When Petra said she knew where she was going, that was not strictly true. It was a self-defense mechanism, not to be beholden to anyone kicking in automatically. This institution was like any other, she reasoned to herself. Having spent the majority of her life in an institution, this one would be easy to work out. GL1, ground floor, laboratory 1, she reasoned to herself. Ha! Piece of cake. The school followed a strict hierarchical structure. The 5th year classrooms were on the 2nd floor, 4th years on the 1st floor, and 3rd years were on the ground floor. It was an eccentricity of some English schools that there were no 1st or 2nd years in high school. The school was a typical post-war establishment of brick, steel and glass that lacked any architectural finesse or atmosphere. The science labs were a single-storey annex at one end. A single straight corridor ran the length of each floor, with classrooms or other rooms on each side. As the population increased, annexes were thrown up at each end to take specialist subjects such as sciences, arts, and material technologies, with no effort to match the original building or infect each other. While the science annex was at one end of the building, the art and crafts workshops were at the other. She descended to the ground floor, assuming the room was in the opposite direction to the one taken by Jennifer, and she followed the corridor. When she ran out of corridor, she went through a door across a covered walkway to the annexes. She arrived, having only made one wrong turn just as the class was settling down. All eyes turned towards her. The silence was deafening. More faces, more scrutiny. Great, she thought to herself, mentally rolling her eyes. This day is just getting better and better. And you are? Mr. Klein's voice boomed. He was the exact opposite of his name, standing over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders, thick bushy eyebrows, and a square-cut beard with a flat-top haircut, all of which gave him a lupine appearance and earned him the name of Wolfman. Petra Connell, sir. Petra felt as if she could climb into one of his jacket pockets and hide, and half wished that she could. Ah, the new girl. Well, don't just stand there like a spare part. Find a seat. He gestured vaguely. The lab was arranged in long, wide benches, with sinks and gas taps for Bunsen burners in the centre. The students perched on high stools in twos and threes around each sink. She could see no spare stools, and no one beckoned her over. Mr. Klein had already turned his back and was preparing to start the lesson. At the back of the room, she found a solitary stool under a bench, and she climbed up onto the last unoccupied sink. First break! The bell sounded and everyone scrambled for the door. Unsure of what to do, Petra followed the crowd, but never made it to the door. Petra, Mr. Klein said as she passed his desk. Wait a minute, please. Come with me. He let Petra through a door behind his desk and into a small, untidy office that smelled of stale cigarette smoke and was crammed from floor to ceiling with books and equipment. He reached up and pulled down an extremely weighty and dog-eared tome called GCE Physics and handed it to her. I should have given this to you at the start of the lesson. Put your name and form on the inside cover. Petra flipped the book open and saw that the inside cover was already full of previous owners that had been scratched out, partially raised and scribbled over. You should have spoken up. I hope you weren't too lost. He smiled disarmingly for such a scary-looking man, but then his face turned serious. He spent most of the lesson staring into mid-air. I don't tolerate slacking, he warned. Yes, sir. No, sir, Petra stammered. The truth was that Petra not only followed the lesson, but found it far too light to keep her attention. She should have anticipated that. She would have to be better prepared from now on. She had actually made mental notes of all the gaps in Mr. Klein's narration, as well as differences in her understanding of Mr. Klein's teaching. She knew she was right on all counts, but she didn't feel comfortable pointing out her teacher's apparent errors. The omissions were probably due to the level of learning required, rather than an error on the teacher's part, she reasoned to herself. No, sir, I like physics, she admitted, which was probably the first whole truth she had uttered all day. Mr. Klein nodded without smiling. Then I'll see you next lesson, but just because you're the new girl doesn't mean you're going to get away without finishing your homework, he warned. No, sir. Of course, sir. Homework was the least of her worries. She'd already done most of the problems in her head as he was describing them. All she had to do was write them down in a fashion that would satisfy him. The advice of her guardians rang loud and clear in her head. Write down all logical steps, no matter how trivial they may seem. Very well. He nodded, apparently satisfied. Go and have your break. Thank you, sir. By the time Petra had made it into the corridor, it was deserted. The physics lab overlooked one of the school's 2 play areas, a square of black tarmac marked with overlapping lines for various sports, with playing fields beyond that. Petra had noticed a lot of activity through the windows of the physics lab, so she headed in that direction. The cacophony of noise that assaulted her eardrums as she walked out of the door almost caused her to bolt for cover like a frightened squirrel. She held her ground and found herself fascinated by the sheer number of students in various groups, all engaged in different activities. She walked around the periphery, taking it all in. Bit by bit, the apparent chaos and confusion started to coalesce into patterns. The youngest, the third years, engaged in groups of skipping games, kicked balls with no apparent purpose or rules, or just seemed content to chase each other around at random. The fourth years formed into more organised games of netball and football, with coats for goalposts. The fifth years were less energetic. They mostly huddled in small groups, engaged in animated discussions. The sixth formers didn't even bother leaving the comfort of their private domain, and just looked disdainfully out of their common room drinking tea or juice. The sixth form block was a single-storey square building that separated the two play areas, almost a self-contained establishment in itself. Sixth formers were rarely seen in the main building, except to take lessons in one of the science labs or art rooms. They even wore different ties, and their blazers were tailored to look more like business suits. Some of the girls even wore trousers. Petra felt jealous. Next year, she promised herself, if I survive this one. Hey, lesbo bitch. Petra was shoved roughly from behind. It was hard enough to send a person of her stature sprawling, but she shifted her weight instinctively and spun to face her antagonist to dispel the kinetic energy. Stephen looked disappointed. He'd been robbed of the amusement of watching her fall and probably hurt herself. He was a good head taller than Petra, and probably twice her weight, although most of it was fat rather than muscle. His sandy hair hung lifeless and greasy down below his collar, and his blue eyes had a malevolent glint in them. He was flanked by two of the boys. Lesbo? Petra thought, searching for a translation for the colloquialism. Lesbian? She asked, without thinking of the consequences. Where did that come from? Only lesbians wear trousers, Stephen guffawed, pointing at her legs. His cronies followed suit in their own round of forced laughter in appreciation of Stephen's observational wit. So, you're all lesbians, are you? Petra responding, pointing at the boy's legwear and immediately regretting not reining in her natural retort mechanism. She was used to having quick-fire banter with the doctors and nurses at the hospital, but this was real life. Stephen's face flushed with anger, and he clenched his fists. Petra cast round in panic. Most people hadn't even noticed the confrontation, but there were a couple of groups close by that had fallen silent and were watching proceedings surreptitiously. Petra saw a familiar flash of long blonde hair and looked imploringly at Jennifer, who was standing not far away with two friends, but she pointedly turned her back on Petra. Petra looked back at Stephen, who was still winding himself up into a frenzy of righteous indignation. Petra's brain screamed at her in panic, and she fled. Yeah, you'd better run, bitch. Why don't you fuck off back to Harry fucking Reimers with the rest of the lesbians? Stephen shouted after her, along with raucous agreement from his friends. Petra headed for the nearest entrance back into the main school. Above the door, carved into a stone beam, was the word girls. It was a hangover from a less enlightened age of segregation of the sexes. The corresponding boys' entrance was at the other end of the building, leading to the second play area. It did mean, though, that the girls' toilets were just inside the door. Petra crashed through the door and ricocheted into the nearest cubicle, slamming the door after her. She sat there with her heart pounding until the bell sounded for the end of break. She waited until the clamour of students returning to class had died away before unlocking her cubicle and heading for her next lesson. Mathematics. Mr. Driver was an old-style teacher in his mid-50s. He tolerated no insubordination from his students and had no time for modern methods, which he considered pandering to the lowest common denominator, a witticism that would have amused Mr. Driver if he'd had a sense of humour. Unlike Mr. Klein, Mr. Driver gave Petra no grace period just because she was new. In fact, he went out of his way to single her out for special attention, which pleased the rest of the class. Petra could almost hear a collective sigh of relief that the spotlight was not coming their way today. She was still so rattled from her encounter with Stephen that she fumbled a couple of times. She mentally kicked herself. They were not difficult questions, but he seemed to deliberately word them to trip her up. Mr. Driver seemed almost pleased that the new girl was not performing as well as his star pupils, which vindicated his teaching method in his own mind. By the time the lunch bell sounded, she was mentally exhausted. Petra sat in the farthest corner of the farthest table in the lunch hall. No one sat next to her or even introduced themselves. She looked around nervously as she nibbled her sandwiches and sipped her juice, like a small bird pecking at the ground, all the while expecting a cat or a larger bird to pounce on her. She saw Stephen and his cronies jostling some third years at the other end of the hall until they moved. She was sort of pleased that she was not the sole centre of his attention, but also puzzled as to why no one, not even the teaching staff, seemed to intervene or even notice. Almost as if he had a sixth sense, Stephen looked up from his game and smiled maliciously at her. She looked away in alarm and suddenly found the bread of her sandwiches intensely interesting. After lunch, she locked herself in a cubicle in the girls' toilet to administer her lunchtime injections into her thigh. Then she explored the rest of the building, which wasn't difficult, and by the time it was time to return to her classroom, she had mapped the whole building in her head. She timed her approach to arrive just before Mr. Wilson, and sat down with a stony stare, not catching anyone's eye, especially Stephen. As soon as Mr. Wilson had finished afternoon registration and the first lesson bell sounded, she was near the front of the crush to get out of the door before Stephen could react. During afternoon break, she retreated to her private cubicle in the toilets again, until she could make it safely to her last lesson. Finally, at the end of the day, she ran for the exit, hoping that tomorrow would be a better day.